museums to change and alter 60 different families' views of themselves as science participants. We're looking at science capital and what's called family habitus. So we're trying to make science something that these families do for fun and to ultimately change kids' career goals. And so that one's been very interesting because every step along the way we've had to negotiate with the museum. What are the research questions? What's the data we're going to collect? How do we collect the data? We will jointly disseminate the data in different communities. And so it, to me, really is becoming more along the line. In that particular case, the targeted audience is the museum, educators, not necessarily the families, although the families are our partners. But the third one is the one that is probably much, much more in light of engaged scholarship, which is teacher action research. So we have teachers who come into our programs. They identify their own question they want to ask out in the schools. They collect the data, analyze the data, own the data, and they make a choice about whether they ever want to share that data or not. So in that sense, we help them, we assist them in their journey as they are doing their teacher action research, but it is clearly not our question, not our data. We don't even disseminate it in any way. It's the ownership of that teacher in the context of that school. So those are 4 examples I thought sort of might represent that continuum and what defines engaged scholarship in terms of who owns it, who controls it, how we work here at the university with our partners. The end goal for us is still to improve science teaching and learning, but the ways in which we're going about that scholarship differ a lot. And then I'll close, but I'll end with just a couple of things that I think are challenges for us and maybe some conflicts. So challenges for us are that the institutions have very different missions. Our mission as a university and as a researcher is not the same mission that our public schools have. And I think that always creates an inherent conflict for us when we're trying to go out and do research in schools. I'll say it, some of y'all can jump on me, but sometimes I think our partners in the schools are not able to be forward-thinking enough to know what the interesting research questions are, whereas some of us at the university get to just sit and think about it all the time, and those folks are busy doing a service. And so I think sometimes we don't know what the right questions are to ask for their context, and they are not able sometimes to think in the very strong future about where we could be going and what's really, really innovative in education. So that's a challenge. We have different missions, different contexts, and the ability to focus on different aspects of education can put us in conflicting kinds of roles. Schools often these days don't value research. They are very focused on raising test scores because that's what they're held accountable for. And the goal is not necessarily innovation or excellence. It's on raising test scores, and those are not always the same thing. And it's a sad state of affairs, but that's how it is. And then just to sort of add, for us, IRB and the school system research approvals can be a huge burden to doing more meaningful collaborations because it's not fluid, it's very prescribed, very defined, and very limiting in the kinds of partnerships we can do in a public school kind of arena. So, thank you.
So I apparently should have worn my lab coat.
That's right.
I'd be much more confident at the moment. So I think a lot about engagement in terms of its role in governance of especially emerging technologies. And so I think about issues around stakeholder and community and public engagement. And what I want to do in my short amount of time here is talk to you a little bit at a very high level of how we might think about those engagement processes with a framework or two, really briefly. And then I'll just give you an example of the research I'm doing on a particular engagement project. So a really famous paper by Rowan Frewer created a framework for thinking about engagement, different kinds of engagement. Oftentimes we say something like, let's do public engagement, but that can mean a lot of things. One typology to think about that is, what is the direction of information flow? So sometimes we do engagement, and it's a kind of outreach, which means that we're trying to send information from the organizers of the engagement out to another audience, right? So the information is flowing outward. Another kind they call a consultation, which is where the information is flowing the other way. We want to know what the public thinks, or what a public thinks, what a particular group of stakeholders thinks, and so we're soliciting information from them through a survey or a focus group or things like that. And then they talk about public participation as a type of engagement where information is flowing in both directions. And arguably that happens less frequently than the other two. We're pretty good at marketing our work or consulting to find out what people think and then maybe considering it later. But we're less good at creating engagements where information is flowing in both directions at the same time. And I like to think about, so shifting gears a little bit, acknowledging that two-way flow of information is the hardest. I think there's a piece missing from that model. And I think of it in terms of the metaphor of grasping hands. When you really engage with another, to grasp their hand means not only are you connected, but you're both vulnerable to being moved. And that vulnerability to being moved is really different than just thinking about the information. It has to do with humility and power and influence and really listening. And so the kind of engagement that I try to foster and to study is the kind where multiple parties, both high status and low status, powerful, less powerful, experts and lay people, are all vulnerable to being moved by that engagement. And so I'll give you an example of my own research where I'm trying to figure that out. So I'm studying the genetically modified American chestnut tree, which is a technology that's being submitted for regulatory approval probably this quarter. And there's a big question about how will public audiences react to this, how will the regulatory system react to this, and so there's an interest in thinking about how would we engage public audiences about this emerging technology. It's potentially the first GMO to be released that's meant to spread and persist in the environment. So it's really different. How should we do that? For a long time, social scientists like me have just been going out and doing experiments. You know, we go out and we do engagement, we run a focus group, we run a citizen forum, things like that. And part of my stance is that maybe I'm not the right person to make all these design decisions, that we need input from stakeholders in these issues to help us make these very specific design decisions. And I've chosen the word design even though I don't know much about design, but I think they are strategic decisions about what engagement can look like. And so I'll just run through what am I thinking about to make those decisions. And I'm actually convening a stakeholder workshop here at NC State next month around the GM chestnut tree. Dalton is helping with that workshop to talk about these particular design questions before we go out and do broader public engagement. So design question number one is who? We're always constructing an audience when we do engagement. It's never generic public engagement. So who counts? How do you deal with issues of polarization out in multiple publics and other stakeholders? Second is, what do you ask? What do you want to know? What are you trying to get out of this engagement? And that has to do with the problem framing. And you impose a lot when you decide what questions you're going to ask or how you frame the problem when you engage broader audiences. Next is, what do you think people need to know to engage in a responsible and productive way? You know, a phone survey gives very little background information before we ask somebody what they think. But when I think about engagement, I think about what sort of information and access to expert knowledge do people need to have the ability to thoughtfully make their preferences known and to deliberate about different possibilities. Next is, how do you make it matter? So I've written against my own work because some social scientists like me do engagement and we say that it's going to make a difference, but it actually doesn't. Because we haven't thought about that ahead of time. We haven't embedded these engagements into existing decision making networks. So we have this really constructive, participatory, cool conversation with experts and citizens, and they come up with cool recommendations, and then they just evaporate in thin air. And I don't think that's responsible. And so we need to think about that design decision of how do you embed that kind of process into an existing decision-making framework. And then lastly, how do you create the kind of vulnerability of the engagement that I described? It's easy to help experts participate as experts and have them come in and give presentations and answer questions, but that doesn't create vulnerability. So how can you create an interaction where there's really different kinds of people in the room with different kinds of expertise, where everybody is a little bit vulnerable, everybody's position is at risk of being moved through that interaction?
Hello. I'd like to address an equivocation that's present in the use of the word engagement. Words like engagement are words that very few people are negatively predisposed to. Engagement is good, and so as a result, it gets co-opted to various kinds of interpretations and agendas. The same thing's true of, for example, leadership or innovation. We're all into innovation and leadership, and it means different things. It means different things. One sense of the term engagement, which I think isn't really what we're talking about at this workshop, but I'll dwell on it just for a couple of minutes because I think the contrast is very significant, is the sense in which we want students to be engaged in educational settings. We often talk about student engagement. We don't necessarily mean by that engagement in some community project. We just mean that they're not just showing up. Well, actually, they are showing up, but when they do show up, they're actually paying attention and listening. And by the way, I must commend our colleagues from Indiana because they're the only people sitting in the front row. And so that's a good signal of engagement when we're teaching, right? Who's at the front of the room? Just kidding. So there's various signals of engagement. The way I like to think of it is the big challenge that we have, I think, in higher education, particularly in STEM-intensive areas like engineering, is for students to really believe and internalize the belief that their education is their education. It's not something that happens to them. And this creation of agency, this idea that I'm creating my future self through my educational experiences, and ultimately I'm the person who's going to be responsible for this, is something we want to cultivate. But there's a bad side to this too, or there's an excess beyond which we can go. And I think that's sometimes displayed in the way that we often talk about and promote leadership programs among students. At Georgia Tech, we have really exceptional students, and it's tempting. It's easy for us to fall into the temptation of pandering to their potential, telling them, as we like to do, particularly when they're present, parents are present in orientation sessions, that they're future leaders. And we hope they are, but it encourages a mode of thinking, I think, sometimes that they are going to know the answers. And that for those of you who know Piaget, that their learning will be a process of assimilation, not of accommodation. So we, and it's no accident that, particularly in computing, and as much about engineering, we have lots of people who are big fans of Ayn Rand, and who's the architect in one of her novels who designs buildings that are really truly awful, one imagines, because everybody criticises them, but he thinks they're all wrong and sets out to prove them wrong, and this is a good thing apparently. And so I think that the idea that inculcating a spirit of humility is very important, and that's a rather different, that's, I think, encouraged by a rather different notion of engagement with others who are different from you, particularly those outside the walls of the university. And one of the things that we try to do with our community engagement activities in Serve, Learn, Sustain is build these relationships, these networks that exist for fairly long periods of time, at least over a year, so that it's not, we want to discourage students and faculty from swooping in from from campus, solving their problem in their white coats, using our community partners essentially not as partners but as sites for investigation, exploiting them essentially with the best of intentions and not realising this is what they're doing, and leaving a bad taste for the next attempted engagement later. So we have to really build a sense of true partnership, which sometimes means that students and faculty get to work on problems that the community partners identify as the ones that they really need help with, which may not be exotic enough or sophisticated enough or interested enough to engage their academic interest as much. And so this is a two-way process. We also, I think, try to tell, we do tell our students, perhaps a little too much, that they're problem solvers, as if the world is like a gigantic textbook with problems. It's just not a textbook and the answers aren't at the back, but it's a kind of moral equivalent of a textbook, that it's full of problems. The world isn't full of problems. The world is full of situations. And part of the art of being a truly educated person with taste is being able to identify problems, to be able to say, here is where I think I need to marshal my expertise and where I can help people. And reasonable people can disagree about the nature of problems, not only how to solve them. This is really what Riddle was talking about in his notion of wicked problems. Many of the most interesting problems that we can work on are problems of that kind. So I think that engagement often brings up issues like this. I really liked what Jason said about the notion of vulnerability to be moved, and I think this idea that we have to be and we have to model this with our students, that we're vulnerable to being moved. We're not just moving the other and helping them from coming in from headquarters, I think is really important. Finally, I'd say we haven't talked very much in this workshop about ethical theory and the teaching of ethics, other than as something we ought to perhaps not apologise for, but treat very sensitively. And I think that there's an opportunity here not just to incorporate ethical theory, but to mould it. I know that this is an area which is over 2,000 years old, but the world is changing the way, I think, radically that we can think about ethical values. And in particular, there's a school of thought in engineering in particular, which was demonstrated at an NAE workshop I was at, and I think a couple of you were also at last year, a rather narrow view that professional ethics is really about adhering to a code of conduct which other people have written. And it's a compliance model of ethics. And we certainly do want people to meet community standards if they're members of a profession. But I think it's much more important to think, particularly in the kinds of emerging professional practices we see today, to think about ethics as a design or imaginative activity. My computer science students are very familiar with the concept of a search space. And so you're in a state, and there's a future out there with a search horizon, and you like gameplay, computer chess programs, and you can make a certain number of discrete choices or moves. In ethical terms, some of those might be ruled out by categorical imperative or the 10 Commandments or something, but you still have choices, and in the future there will be various kinds of outcomes. There's an evaluation function. It's a language they can think in terms of they like this, but this isn't the way we think about ethics normally in our everyday life. We're not presented with dilemmas. We're presented with situations, and we have to come up with potential solutions, not only choose among them. And I think that since we speak the language of design, one way of engaging in ethical problems is actually to think of them as design problems. And one of my colleagues, Bob Kirkman in our School of Public Policy, is actually put into his ethics teaching that it's a design course, not a problem-solving course. Finally, I just want to say that I think all of these ideas, however good or bad you think they are from all of us, really only gain traction if we start thinking about them at institutional level. We have to stop thinking of ourselves as teachers who teach our courses, because our courses don't matter for very long, for very many people. What does matter, what do matter, are curriculum and programs And they're the kinds of things which don't get changed very often, okay? And where we introduce things into the structure of programs, initiatives that have a long life and have some kind of longitudinal continuity, that's where we can really make things happen. So I'd urge you to think much more in those kinds of terms and think big.
All right, questions for our panelists. I know it's the middle of the day. We've been here since 8, but I'm sure you all have some questions. Yes.
Okay. Do we need to play microphone, or can everyone hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. I guess
Well, I guess we only have one working.
That's fine. I'll just project. I wonder in all of this if how much we need to take into account intentional disengagement on the part of students or others as a potential reaction to these kinds of initiatives. So say the questions that we're going to be discussing in our breakout sessions begin with, putting people in engaged settings doesn't necessarily lead to engagement. It can lead to active disengagement. How do we deal with that, perhaps?
I mean, maybe this is naive, but I feel like people engage when there's something at stake, when they can make a difference and they see an advantage. And so if people are disengaging, it means that the engagement that you've set up isn't meeting their needs. Right? So it's like a protest against what you've set up as the structure.
Yeah, I guess I'm coming at this from some research, at least, that suggests that STEM students in general tend to think about their decision to enter those fields as being an active mechanism to divorce themselves from questions they don't want to worry about. STEM is a safe place to go because I don't have to do these things.
Right.
So.
But then, do we let them?
Right. That's the thing. So, is universal engagement an expectation we should have? Can we force?
I don't know. But it's a very good question. It's part of a much broader question, which is the paternalism that is inherent in all education. Mm-hmm. We're universities, we're not supermarkets. And so it's appropriate for us to exercise some leadership over sometimes unwilling or intransigent customers. But only up to a point, because I think, we're dealing with adults. They're young adults. They're adults on training wheels. But if we don't give them choices, including choices to disengage, then I'm not sure that I'm not sure that that's actually even a moral kind of course of action in its own right. There's also a difference, I think, talking of equivocations, we have to be really careful about STEM as if it's one thing. There's a world of difference between engineering and mathematics, let's say. And I was very interested in visiting your institution, actually, just a few weeks ago, and talking to some of your colleagues about this very exciting general education overhaul that's taking place, and how either, as I understand it, global awareness or ethical awareness is going to be introduced into every single general education course, including mathematics. I can imagine a conversation with someone that it would be totally inappropriate to resist that in an area to do with the social sciences, and yet it's very awkward to see how you would, to me at least, without having thought about this very much, how you would do more than pay lip service to this in a calculus class. And I think we have to be a little bit careful about that, because then students aren't stupid, and they see us jumping through these kinds of hoops that we've created for ourselves. And I'm not suggesting that the general education thing is a set of superficial hoops. But unless it's done with care and attention, this is what will happen. And I'll say, oh, they're just checking the diversity box, they're just checking the global awareness box, you know, and it will become another insincere kind of gesture. So I think picking our battles is actually very important.
I'll just add, the poster right here, I think, gave me some ideas too, that it's about development, and part of our job as educators is to create environments that help students see why care and engagement are important and why they should care. And I think the whole idea of choice is part of being a great educator, and that we have to help them develop those kind of dispositions. And for engineering and fields like engineering and teaching, we teach dispositions, and we teach them about some of these fuzzier areas like care. And that we just have to recognize students are on a continuum as well. So hopefully they'll get there, but we have to be very smart educators to figure out how to engineer an environment where those kinds of dispositions will be developed. I guess that's my response.
I'll just say one more quick thing, which is I have a hunch that it took a lot of work to take the politics and the values and the social significance out of all these courses and these curricula over time. And so putting it back in is going to take some work.
Thanks a lot.
I think the panel is feeling much too guilty. My teaching background is, a lot of it is in biological sciences, and I've been an advisor for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students in the biological sciences. And I think there's a percentage, I don't know what the number is, 10, 20% of students who really don't care, even if it's in their major. It's not ethics courses, it's in their major. For example, reproductive physiology. Nobody takes that because it's a general education course that they're going to try out. And you have a certain percentage of students who just, all they're concerned about is barely passing and whatever else they do in their life. So aren't you on the panel worrying too much about getting every last student engaged?
I think we have an obligation to meet every student in our classes. Personally, I can't imagine who's not interested in reproductive biology. It's an innately interesting topic, and if we can't make it relevant and interesting, I think the burden's on the teacher. But I'm a teacher educator, and I never point fingers at the student. I point fingers at us as educators to figure out how to meet their needs and figure out what's interesting to them. So I personally think the class would be awesome. I don't know about everybody else.
I'll chime in. I'm not on the panel, but I'll chime in. So I teach a class. It's interdisciplinary. I'm a psychologist by training, and I have a class where it's entitled Psychology and the African American Experience. And we talk about some really heavy things in that class. And I have engineering students, biology students. And the first day they're like, why am I here? It's a required course. But as a teacher, as an instructor, it's my job to make it relevant to them, regardless of their background, regardless of their discipline. And so I have engineering students say, Dr. Banks, I didn't think about it in that way. Or a biology student to say, I didn't think about this real world issue in that way because I'm an engineering student. So I think it's our responsibility as educators to make it relevant. And so it's going beyond just doing research to publish in articles, but it's doing research, it's talking about these theories and the application of it for students. So I take it as my responsibility, and I might not get 100%, but I'll get 90% of the students in my classroom to actually get it, to see how it's relevant and how it makes what they do better. So I'm not going to give up that hope.
One great figures in virtue ethics, Marcus Aurelius starts the body of his meditations with the thought that every day, or today, he says, he talks to him about himself in the second person, you are going to encounter backsliders, backstabbers, people who are just, you know, a waste of time, and it's not really their fault. Let it just slide off your back, in words to that effect. And it's very wise advice from an emperor of the Roman Empire. And I think, Henry, you're absolutely right. I think we should take that on board ourselves. It's not necessarily, you know, it's not a question of blame, and it's not a question of guilt. I think it's just, all of us have a locus of control, and it's not as broad as sometimes we'd like to think it is. Other people will make the choices they make, and we can lead them towards it, but like the proverbial horse, they don't always want to drink.
Hi, so Erin, I'm so glad that you brought the example up in your class, because I thought this would have came up a little bit earlier, but talking about diversity and diverse groups, we're talking about student engagement, but when we look at students of color or women in particular, and we look at engineering, to get more specific, there's a decline. If we look at Black women in particular, Black women are not persisting in engineering. So what can we do? This is an ethical issue. I brought up the example in our breakout session about Facebook with face recognition, and how it was a complete fail because you couldn't distinguish a Black person versus a chimpanzee, meaning that Black people weren't a part of the design process, they weren't part of the research, and weren't part of the development. That is an ethical and a moral issue. So what can be done? How do we get more voices a part of the discussion into the table?
I think that question connects to the previous discussion really well too, which just reminds us that, you know, the group that tends not to engage is not some random group, right? They're not engaged perhaps for a reason. So in the classroom setting, people who are not engaged may be not engaged because they didn't have the same kind of preparation, they didn't come from the same kind of privilege, or they're working full time and they're tired. And so those are justice issues, not just issues of who happens to be paying attention or not. And so if, you know, reframing it from like our responsibility to reach every student, which creates guilt and bad feelings when someone doesn't pay attention in your class, what about if it's just an opportunity? Like, we have an opportunity. Those of you who teach classes, when you get to the first day and you look around, don't you feel like, oh my gosh, this is an incredible opportunity where I get to help direct the conversation and the thought and the work of this group of people in a significant way for a whole semester? It's incredible the privilege that we have and the opportunity that we have. And so if part of what we see in that opportunity is not just reaching the students who are already, you know, on their seats, excited to do the work and can't wait to find out what you know, but also the student in the back who's hasn't been engaged, who isn't really sure about you, who's not sure that they can connect with you, what have you got to them? That's an opportunity.
So I got kind of a, not a completely short and to the point question, but I have been grappling with the issue of trigger warnings, and we had a very nice presentation from women in women's studies come over and explain it. That actually came out of fan fiction, because you have all these beloved characters, and then fan fiction people take the characters and write different stories for them and put them online. And trigger warnings are basically explaining things you maybe wouldn't expect to have happening with these characters that you like, would be represented or portrayed in this story. And so you can choose to read it or not. And it occurs to me that if we're going to infuse these things into individual classes, that you might trigger some students who really didn't expect this. And so I'm really thinking about Colin's point that it needs to be about the curriculum and about the program, because springing it on students when we're grappling with this now, we're trying to teach ethics in a Python programming class. The students don't expect to be dealing with the ethics of programming and the IT industry in a Python class. So how do we signal to them that this is what's going to happen? And we're trying to signal it to them at the level of the major, but it's harder to signal that at the level of a mechanical engineering major. So how do you get them to understand and to expect that these are the kinds of things that they're going to be grappling with, so that they can be more receptive to it?
I wouldn't want to be misconstrued as suggesting that we shouldn't be doing that. Actually, I think it's a great thing to do, but if it's done sensibly and appropriately. In fact, I've taught a Python class myself, and I've done exactly this. But talking about computational complexity and talking a little bit about the life of Alan Turing, you know, and students they see this as kind of the backstory, and it's fun and it's interesting, but it fit. It wasn't a gratuitous, you know, now we've got to have our module on ethics. So I think it has to be done in a careful way. As to the truth in advertising way, I mean, I'd be very careful about conflating this with a trigger warning controversy, but the idea of giving some upfront expectation, if it's something that's done throughout the curriculum and it's something which is in the institutional practice, which, you know, for example, at Virginia Tech it's going to become, that won't really be necessary. You know, you can almost imagine students saying, when are we going to get to the ethics part, you know, in this topology class. I'm not sure that this is an issue unless it's jarring because it's the only time it ever happens and it's inappropriate for the context. So it's not really so much a preparation issue, I think, as an aptness question.
So we've talked a lot about engaging the student and how to address the students who are no longer want to be engaged. But I kind of want to reverse that a little bit. As an undergraduate student, I've had a few professors where I felt no longer cares about teaching this course, and they are no longer engaged. So my question is, like, what can I do as a student when something like that happens, and is it a responsibility from other professors to, I guess, get involved?
Let me think about an answer to that, but I want to say something else first. And just to clarify that you two guys and the other undergraduates we heard from have kicked your training wheels off long ago, and I don't want to give you. So, and I think you've been an example of exactly the kind of engagement we want from students. You've got to comment on faculty who are disengaged.
I mean, I think we faculty should have a strong commitment to being engaged. Faculty are human, but you have student evaluations, and that's one of the most effective ways, at least in my college, to give some feedback. Most of us also have to have peer observations of our teaching, which in some colleges works and some it doesn't. But I mean, we're aware. I think our administrators are aware of who's not engaged, and in any human organization, you know, I think administrators struggle with what to do in those contexts. And I mean, in my own department, I'll say it, we've been very effective in weeding out some of those folks and reassigning some of those folks. So maybe they do research or they go out and do other things, but they may not be front and center with students. But I'm in a college of education where the students are our absolute critical mission. So, I mean, it is a huge issue, and yeah.
I think it connects to what Colin shared earlier about the difference between a class and a curriculum. You know, the problem of disengaged faculty is a structural problem, and an incentive problem, and a cultural problem. And all of us in this room have the power to keep pushing for there to be a culture that values teaching and innovative teaching and reflective teaching and rewards that. I mean, how many times have we heard that to get tenure, You need to be a great researcher, a great fundraiser, and a good enough teacher. That is the accepted wisdom in academia. And when we all reproduce that, right? And so I don't know exactly what the answer is, but if all of us are resisting that a little bit in ways that we can, and when we get to be, vice provosts, we have the ability to resist that in more powerful ways. Come on. but it's so great that as students you're thinking about that. What can you do? Student evals is one answer, but it's not even a drop in the bucket. I would say, write an anonymous letter to the department chair. Other faculty might be mad for me to say that, but we need to be called out. We need to be held accountable. And a couple of bad teaching evaluations isn't going to do it. We've set up a system that doesn't punish bad teachers. And teaching evaluations are so far removed from important promotion and tenure decisions that they have to be really consistently bad to make a difference.
Plus, they're unfair in a lot of ways with the diversity angle of it, women and underrepresented minorities and African American teachers, and they're all evaluated lower than white males. So that's just another angle to it.
No, and the textual comments can actually be really hurtful as well. Only a small number of them. There was an article in Inside Higher Ed or Chronicle this morning about that topic. Two cultural notes. There's an REM song called Sad Professor, which I think says it all. And there's a great book, I can't remember the name of the author, I'm just blanking on it. He's a professor at Hamilton College called How College Works, and it's brilliant. It's a combination of qualitative research on students and faculty at his institution and institutional IR data. It's actually co-written with a former student of his, who's now a graduate student, I think, at the University of Chicago. It's got some really, really good insights about college. I'm at Georgia Tech, can't imagine a place as different. And reading through it, it was almost like he was describing my institution. So there are universals. And one of them, it's full of this wise kind of folksy advice, which is very unusual for a book published by Harvard University Press. And one of the pieces that sticks in my mind is he says, okay, so you've got an old, misogynistic, crusty professor who, has been tenured for years and is not quite nearing retirement yet. This goes back to what Susan was saying earlier about the possible sunsetting of tenure, but we're not there yet. What do you do in a situation like this? He says, the only thing that I can recommend is you give him the 8 o'clock classes and hope nobody signs up. And, in a sense, that's a kind of counsel of despair, but I think mixed with this advice of not just teaching evaluations, but some degree of behind-the-scenes lobbying that something is wrong, can actually make things happen with even the most intransigent professors, because everybody's proud about their professional standing. And generally speaking, someone who's like that isn't a superstar researcher either. Our experience is that although there are trade-offs in the amount of time people can spend on research, things like traveling, that's inherent in coming to meetings like this and teaching, generally speaking, the people who are doing groundbreaking research are so enthusiastic about it that they don't resent teaching undergraduate students the basic materials. And I think we have to try to avoid this false dichotomy that exists in many people's minds that if you're good at teaching, and some colleagues actually tell us, the junior faculty, don't win a teaching award because that's a sign you're not serious. We have to stop that. But equally, we have to stop the idea that you can't be good at both and that they don't go hand in hand. I think they can synergize in many cases. And finding the right teaching assignments for junior faculty in particular is critical to this, so that they're not torn in multiple directions, but they're able to innovate. And it's the more senior people who should not, it's the junior people who should be given the plum teaching appointments, because they're the ones who are establishing their reputations and need to invest more time. And it's the senior people who they should not be given the plums. They should be giving something to the team because they've earned it.
And so, Jason, it struck me when you, in your initial remarks, when you were talking about your approach to engagement, that you've been doing a lot of rethinking about it. In fact, I was particularly struck when you said something like, speaking against my own practice here, or something to that effect. That you had done things in a certain way, but now we're rethinking and maybe you should be doing them in a different way. So, how does that translate into mentoring students who work with you? You know, are they bedazzled by the self-reflection of the professor, or say something about that? Because I think it's an interesting process you go through, but it's not clear how that transfers into mentoring students.
Dalton? Seriously.
So what Jason said, I want to quote him. Yeah, sure. So I have only been for 2 months, so in certain ways it is to students' help, but I can say upon meeting Jason for the first time at 4S in Boston last year, I was immediately impressed by the vulnerability he exhibited just in his meeting with the student and how straightforward he was. So when he just said this metaphor of grasping hands and making yourself vulnerable and that you can be moved, I saw that from the first time that I interacted with Jason face to face. So does that kind of help answer your question?
In a way, but
and for me, as his student of 2 months, he has already started to reorient the way that I look at engagement, the way that I look at my own practice as well.
But do you go through, does he walk you through the same process he goes through, or does at some point he say, this is where I'm at now? I mean, I think his thought process is really interesting, and I was just wondering how you convey that to students, other than through example, obviously.
I think, so right now, I don't teach undergraduates, for better or for worse. And so my attitude towards mentoring and teaching graduate students is to sort of welcome them into the fold of my process, and have them join me, and not assume that I need them to tread the path that I tread to get to where I am. They don't need to make the same mistakes. I'd rather have them join me in the struggle to figure things out where I am right now. And if that means I have to explain what I think I'm trying to do, that's okay. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's good, thanks.
Question here, and then I think we can take one more after this, one or two more quick ones after this, so go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. This is more like a comment than a question. So I'm from an engineering education background, so I realize in engineering education there is a tendency to decontextualize many of the problems, problems students are solving every day. Students are solving a lot of problems, like 1,000 problems across their four years. And I had a chance to, last year I had a chance to observe some of the classes on my campus. I realized, especially in the middle level engineering classes, the instructors, most of the cases, they tended to decontextualize many of the problems. And what I'm thinking is that the students in the future, even like fourth year or in the future, anything when you teach that's non-technical or social ethical, they will see as supplementary to their decontextualized engineering practice rather than it's central or integral to their engineering practice. But some of the engineering education researchers, they have been trying to contextualize or recontextualize some of these problems. So I don't know whether this kind of deconceptualized approach of creating problems for students to solve has anything to do with this kind of culture of disengagement among students.
One
one of the really exciting things about Olin, a couple of people have mentioned Olin recently, Mitch was at Olin, it's not just that it might arguably be an effective way of teaching the subject matter, but that it's much more like the experience that architecture students have. If you look at the history of architecture, there have been some rather excessive overstatements by architects about their role in life. They're not just designers of buildings. I mean, Le Corbusier described buildings as machines to live in, and Frank Lloyd Wright, you know, like designed the kitchen utensils and made everything be laid out in just the kind. You can't live in my house unless you live in the way that I dictate. That's going too far. But there's a willingness, I think, to embrace the fact that everything is context in architecture, and the atelier kind of background of architecture, and the fact that there's a studio experience from. You work on little problems when you're inexperienced, but they're contextualized problems. You're designing, you know, a garage for someone's home, or you're, you know, a dog kennel or something. But it's not just a structure, it's also something which has an implied use, there's flow, there's energy issues. No problem it's not, nothing is like algebra. It's always the combination of several things. And I think that encourages architecture students to see what they're doing, perhaps not in Le Corbusier terms, but as designers of spaces that people live in, or work in, or hold meetings in, not just as boxes with lights. And I think in engineering, we sometimes have to encourage students to go that extra step because they're prepared by little decontextualized examples, often examples that aren't even engineering examples, they're mathematics or chemistry examples. So I think you're right, and it does have, I think, consequences on their views about the social role of their profession.
One last question, unless there's any other ones.
Any other last questions? All right, thank you so much.
Okay, it's break time. There's some refreshments. Our next breakout sessions will start at 3:30. The groups have been shuffled, so make sure you check your roster to get your room number. There was some confusion last time about how much time spent in the group. Let's say 50 minutes, and then make it back here, and then that'll give us a little more time to discuss the presentations and ask questions. Patty has some.
Also, we need a scribe for group 2. So, yes, Sharon has leave. So, if there's somebody in group 2 who is willing to be a scribe, y'all work it out in your room. Well, I guess I do have to get you the location. So let me know, and I'll come up to your room and make sure that you have it. Thanks. Oh, one other thing. If anybody missed the super speed tour of the library earlier and wants to have it this time, or wants to do it again, Mitch.
It was so cool, and if you haven't walked through this library, you definitely should.
I'm happy to take a look.
Definitely should.
I wanted to share one of my least favorite conversations. Two-thirds of the way.
So you're absolutely right. Yeah, I get what you're saying. No, I agree.
What's the problem? Well, I don't care, and I don't want to do it. So how can I?
Shouldn't. Oh.
Absolutely. It turned out.
And you know, and
in the scenario, it was his father's idea that he should do this.
That's certainly the case. Now I get what you're saying. Now I absolutely I agree. I sort of indicated I did. I can imagine that, especially if you're in, let's say, biology, and suddenly some social issue is addressing something which is very problematic and hurtful. They might expect that if they're reading James Joyce, but they don't expect it in plant biology. And so when it does come in an unexpected, probably introduced by someone about this experience discussing this material in the first place, it's going to come more about the war.
It's always possible to do it.
Not that I get my real world about except the best one.
Right. You can't win if you don't play the game.
And then learning, after I graduated. So that's how I got this. I went about it.
And Mitch was saying, I don't think I quite had this experience because